Welcome once again to the Upper Room. We're glad to be with you wherever you're viewing this lesson. We will be in John chapter 5 today, and to get there, we're at our location. And our location is Lincoln Park Swimming Pool in Grand Junction. And as you can tell, it's not real active today. It's actually Valentine's Day and nobody is taking their sweetheart swimming. I don't understand it. But the pool is closed probably until Memorial Day or around that time. The reason we're in front of a pool that is not filled at this point is because the story that we come upon in the book of John chapter 5 takes place at a pool. All right, I don't know if that pool had chlorine in it or diving boards or a slide like we have here. So the scene that we're going to come upon in John chapter 5 is my favorite pool scene. My second favorite pool scene comes from a movie that was made in 1992, and the movie is called Sandlot, and it's actually about baseball. If you have never seen it, about these kids who grew up playing baseball together in a sandlot, and it's all kinds of fun. So Sandlot's about this group of kids that play baseball together in 1962, a much simpler time. But my favorite scene in Sandlot is at the swimming pool. And if you've never seen it, let me describe it to you. One of the kids in the group, and there's like 8 kids in the group, and one of the kids' names is Squints. I don't know what his real name is, but they call him Squints because he wears glasses, and when the glasses come off, he's squinting all the time. But he's this little dude that just has fallen in love with the lifeguard on duty at the swimming pool over the years, over the summers. And she's probably, you know, in her late teens, and he is probably, along with his buddies, probably about 11, 12 years old. And he absolutely has fallen in love with her and wishes he could get her attention. And then one day he comes up with this brilliant idea, and the brilliant idea Squints comes up with is, I'm gonna jump in the deep end and just pretend like I'm drowning, and she'll have to come get me. And she does. She comes jumping off the lifeguard chair to save Squints, jumps in, pulls him out, and he pretends like he's drowning, and so she has to do mouth to mouth resuscitation on him. And as soon as she bends down to put her mouth to his mouth, he puts his arms around her and starts kissing her. And she is so angry. I don't remember if she slaps him or what. And by the way, Christy and I have actually met that girl that played that role, but it's hilarious. She finally gets back up in the lifeguard chair, and Squints looks at her like, I won that round, you know, look what I accomplished. And she just smiles at him like, yeah, you got me on that one. But it's such a great scene at a swimming pool. But the scene that we're going to talk about today is the best scene ever at a pool. I would go so far as to call it the most famous pool scene of all time. Now, to get into that, however, I want to take you back to the book of Mark. All right, there's something that Jesus taught in the book of Mark that's going to be really important that we understand today. So it's Mark chapter 2, and we'll begin in verse 18. Here we go. Once when John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, some people came to Jesus and asked, why don't your disciples fast like John's disciples and the Pharisees do? Jesus replied, do wedding guests fast while celebrating with the groom? Of course not. They can't fast while the groom is with them, but someday the groom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. Of course, he's talking about him being the bridegroom, and certainly the friends of the bridegroom, it makes sense. They would never be fasting. They would never say at the great celebration, the great wedding dinner, we're just not going to eat because we're fasting. He says that makes no sense. So while they're with me, we're going to eat. Besides, who would patch old clothing with new cloth? For the new patch would shrink and rip away from the old cloth, leaving an even bigger tear than before. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, for the wine would burst the wineskins, and the wine and the skins would both be lost. New wine calls for new wineskins. What does all that mean? All the talk about mending garments and putting wine in skins. What is it all about? Very simply, Jesus is saying, I have come to bring a new way of thinking. My kingdom brings a new thought process that you're going to have to get used to, and it won't fit into the old way of thinking. Really important. And that concept still holds true today. The kingdom of God is such that to live within the kingdom means to think differently than the kingdom of this world. However, many people who say that they love God, they know God, they believe in God, still think the way the world thinks, the way the culture thinks. And so it's so important that we go back to what Jesus said there in Mark 2 and realize we need to think differently. We cannot live life in the kingdom and think the way we've always thought before, the way everybody else thinks. And so to summarize, the kingdom means that we think in new ways. The old ways of thinking are not of the kingdom of God. And that applies today in what we're going to talk about. And one of the most common things about the old ways of thinking is that life is about rules. There are rules that people live by, and that's going to be a question we need to ponder. Do I still live by rules? The famous songwriter and singer Jim Croce in 1972 wrote these words. You don't tug on Superman's cape, you don't spit into the wind, you don't pull the mask off that old Lone Ranger, and you don't mess around with Jim, whoever Jim was in his life. Those are the rules. You just don't do those things. And we all know the rules, or at least the assumptions that we all live by, correct? But Jesus, when you get to know him, and that's the series we're in, knowing Jesus, because in knowing Jesus, the expression of the Father, we now know the Father as well. And when you know Jesus, you know that he challenged rules and assumptions maybe like nobody else ever did. Are you a rule follower? Christy and I are, we do so much together, but we're really opposites. Christy's a rule follower. I'm a rule breaker for the most part. And so it makes life really interesting. One of the times that came to mind, we were walking into Walmart a couple weeks ago, and you might know if you ever go there, but some of you never go there, and that's okay. If you ever go there, you see that there's two sets of doors as you walk in, and you can choose between the doors that say exit and the doors that say welcome, which means entrance. And then there's some space and you go through another set of doors. Well, usually the greeter is inside that second set of doors, but on this particular day, the greeter, I'm sure she's a fine lady, was standing between the sets of doors. As we approached the doors, normally I would go in the side that says exit. It's closer to the parking lot. I don't know, that rebel inside me. But for some reason on this day, I chose to go clear over, not that it's a lot further, but over to the welcome doors. And they opened for me. Christy, who always goes through the welcome doors, for some reason cut through the exit doors. No big deal, until we were faced with the greeter. She looked at Christy and I swear she rolled her eyes and shook her head, and she looked at me and she said, "Thank you for coming in those doors." And we walked on through, and I immediately inside was bursting with laughter inside. And then Christy immediately comes over to me and she goes, "Can you believe it? The one time I'm a rebel and I get caught." I don't think I said anything. In a rare moment, I held my tongue, but I can tell you I enjoyed the moment immensely. Christy is not used to getting in trouble for being a rebel because she's not. Are you a rule keeper, a rule follower? Sometimes rules are hard to decipher, but not usually. What's very challenging to decipher are assumptions about life. I ran across this article written by a guy by the name of Joshua Becker. And Joshua Becker is an author. He's what they call a minimalist. And he came up with his top 10 assumptions about life, with which, by the way, he does not agree. But I want to go through those really quick and see if you can relate to any of these assumptions and how you feel about them. So here we go. Parenting teenagers is miserable. Number 2, spending extended time with extended family is to be bemoaned. Number 3, I can't wait for retirement. Number 4, a productive life is a busy life. Number 5, we need debt to finance an enjoyable life. Number 6, mothers-in-law are difficult. Number 7, money doesn't change you. Number 8, religion is boring and a sign of weakness. Number 9, kids are terrible in their twos. And number 10, people are talking about me behind my back all the time. And then here's what he says about that last one, which I absolutely agree 100%. Are people talking behind our backs all the time? He says this: I used to think people were talking behind my back until I realized that they were all too busy talking about themselves. I think that's true. Now, some of those assumptions I can agree with, some of them I don't. That religion is boring and a sign of weakness. I kind of tend to think that religion is kind of boring, to be honest with you, and we'll talk more about that in this John 5 passage. So what did you think of his list of assumptions? Do you agree with them? Do you not agree with them? First discussion question: what rules or assumptions do you live by? You know, the reality of it is that the upper room came about because the Holy Spirit prompted us to throw out some assumptions about the church. And we find ourselves in this place where we enjoy the gathering of small communities because we have decided a lot of those assumptions about what the church needs to be are not biblical at all, and they don't need to be adhered to. But that's kind of how practical this can be. So all of that is introduction to get us to where we're going, and I want to give you some kind of new definitions. If you've seen the title of this message, the new definitions for religion are, I believe, the word can't. And the definition I want to give you today for relationships are could, all right? And the two sometimes collide, and they do in our passage today. Can't collides with could, and we'll see the results of this, but I think can't and could really collide in our lives a lot, and we've got to decide on which side of that spectrum we will live, can't or could. We're going to be reading from the book of Hebrews to really illustrate this idea that can't really is important we understand, and it has a lot to do with the religion and the way things were before Jesus came. And it really illustrates why it's so important we move away from the can't way of living, which again, the question today, and we'll come back to it, we'll return to it, is it possible that even if I name the name of Jesus, that I say I follow Jesus, that I still live within the grips of can't, of religion? So I told you we'd read from Hebrews. Here we go, Hebrews chapter 10. We'll read verses 1 through 4 together. The old system of thinking, the old covenant, the old system under the law of Moses was only a shadow, a dim preview of the good things to come, not the good things themselves. The sacrifices under that system were repeated again and again. Yes, year after year, but they were never able to provide perfect cleansing for those who came to worship. Verse 2. If they could have provided perfect cleansing, the sacrifices would have stopped, for the worshipers would have been purified once for all time, and their feelings of guilt would have disappeared. If all those rules they lived by that included the sacrifices of animals would have worked, they would have not needed to keep doing them. Verse 3, but instead, those sacrifices actually reminded them of their sins year after year. Really important there, because that really tells us the importance of religion up to a point. That was to remind people of their shortcomings, how they could not live up to God's expectations. And now the Hebrew writer succinctly summarizes that idea in verse 4 when he says, "For it is not possible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins." It is not possible for religion. That's what it was. These are all the rules you have to live by. It can't take away sins. That's why I'm connecting it to the word, the concept, can't. Religion just can't do for us what we need done. So in other words, no matter what I do, how much I do it, I cannot take care of my greatest problem. And that is the sin that separates me from God. And the same is true for you. Now on the other end of the spectrum is could, because there is a could. And that is that there is something that could resolve the sin in my life, resolve the sickness of my life, but it is a could. It's not a mandate that it will solve the problem. I have some input into this, and so it could be the answer. Now when we speak of could, this caveat needs to come into play, and that is, could sounds like the power of positive thinking, doesn't it? And if you go way back to Norman Vincent Peale, and then a little bit later, Robert Schuller. In our present day, the mega celebrity pastor, Joel Osteen, was all about the could, in the sense of it's all about power of positive thinking. That's not what I mean by could. You're going to find out right away what I mean by could. Now before we get into our text, I want to illustrate that even further. Our son Caleb is so interesting. He doesn't get to sleep very well every single night, and so it takes till sometimes 1, 2, 3 in the morning before he falls asleep. We're usually knocked out by, I'll be honest with you, 9, 9:30. And so he's got this period of time where we're totally asleep and he's just whatever. And what's been happening in the last several months is he hears our neighbors. We have neighbors that are across our road, just 40, 50 yards across our road, and they're neighbors that we've never known well. All right, it's a long story. We've had some interactions. The mother left, took her daughter and left probably 12 years ago. I think she got fed up with the scene with the father and the 2 other boys, and the father is deathly afraid to have conversations. He is such an introvert. The last time I tried to have a conversation with him, he actually came to our house. He had to tell me something, and he couldn't even look me in the eye, and the conversation lasted literally 20 seconds, and I was still talking when he turned and left, walked away. He's a nice guy, but he's just afraid of his own shadow. And then he has these 2 sons, Jared and Kevin. And Jared and Kevin are now in their late 20s, probably bordering on 30, and I call them boys with toys. At their age of life, they now still only care about their toys, about their 4x4s, about their motorcycles, about their other bikes, about their snow machines, their trailers, their campers. That's what their life is about. Okay, so we really don't have, we wave at them and everything's friendly, no problems. But Caleb has decided in the last couple of months to go visit them after we fall asleep. So it's dark and he goes over there, they're outside working on their trucks or whatever they're doing, and he's gotten to know them. And he, as he does with everybody, he has fascinating conversations. But what he's told us is this, that every time he says, "Do you know Jesus?" or "Do you believe in Jesus?" they respond with a very abrupt no, like this is the end of our conversation. And so that's happened a few times. Now the deal with Jared and Kevin is that they could pursue Jesus. They could know Jesus. Caleb would help them. They have no interest. And so it's not that Jesus can't intervene in their lives, but even if he did, and he kind of was doing that with Caleb, they're not interested. So the could is not a definite. It's the possibility is there to know Jesus, know the Father, know eternal life. But for them, at this point, it's not happening. And that's just the way it goes. But that's an example of how it's really could. It's not because God is not able, and we'll get into that, but we all live with some coulds in our life, and that's a relational thing, just like the relational thing that Caleb has attempted to connect with these neighbors of ours. And so what I want to show you in this text is how can't and could collide. And it happens, I think, a lot with Jesus as he interacts with people. Of course, Jesus is of the could camp, and the religious people are of the can't camp, because religion can't reach God. That's been proven by the book of Hebrews, by the entire Bible. That's not to say there wasn't a reason for the Old Covenant, the Old Testament. It was to get people to the place where they could pursue Jesus. Okay, so to make sure you're tracking here, can't represents the religious life. Could represents the relational possibilities with God, and we're going to see that come to fruition. Now, I ask you to turn to John chapter 5. What I need you to know, just kind of a prelude before we get into it, is that John 5, 6, and 7 represent a turn in things. Up until now, in John 1 through 4, the people of Israel who have interacted with Jesus have had this approach with Jesus where they're not sure about him. They're certainly interested in him and curious about him, but beginning in chapter 5 through chapter 7, we see a turning. The Jewish people begin to go from interested, curious, to absolutely rejecting who Jesus is. And you'll begin to see that happening in this passage starting in John 5 verse 1. We're going to slowly go through it, unpack it. The thing I want to show you is how often could and can't collide as Jesus does what Jesus does. So John 5:1, here we go. Afterward, Jesus returned to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish holy days. There were 3 holy days for the Jewish people, and by the way, all men were required to attend these holy days. And so that was a 60-mile trek to the south for Jesus as he was a young man and then became a man. But there are 3 of these, and they begin with Passover, then the Feast of Tabernacles, and then Pentecost. Those were all required for the men. And so Jesus, because it is required, has traveled back south to Judea, to Jerusalem. Verse 2, inside the city, near the sheep gate, was the pool of Bethesda, with 5 covered porches. So they had made these covered porches to help people stay out of the elements, like they have coverings out here in the middle of the summer because it gets up to 100 degrees for quite a while, actually. So they had these covered porches. Crowds of sick people, blind, lame, or paralyzed, lay on the porches. Okay? And that's really important for setting up the story here. Now what comes, the second part of verse 3 and verse 4, was not in the original manuscripts. And I believe they were not in the original manuscripts because it seems to be more commentary as to what was going on there. Okay? So maybe, just maybe, John did not include this, but later people who were translating it said people need to know more context here to make sense of it, and you'll see why they might have done that. So we pick it up in the second part of verse 3 after he has said that sick, paralyzed people were lying there, wholly or in part paralyzed, and they waited for the moving of the waters. From time to time, an angel of the Lord would come down and stir up the waters. The first one into the pool after each disturbance would be cured of whatever disease they had. Okay, so that commentary, I think, and it is commentary, I think was to help people understand what the dynamics were, and I believe it was a belief, maybe even a superstition. I don't think it was fact. I don't think it was fact that an angel came down and stirred the waters and the first one in got healed. I think some things might have happened to make people think that's what was going on. In fact, really, if you do the research, you find out that this pool had a spring that fed it, and the spring was an intermittent spring. That's what historians say, and so that would make sense that every once in a while there'd be some bubbling and stirring of the water, but it wouldn't continue. And then the first one in, it was believed, would get healed. Okay, with all that background now, we move on in the story. Verse 5, one of the men lying there had been sick for 38 years. That is a long time to be sick. Now, what kind of sick, we're not sure. Just that what we're going to find out is he could not jump up and jump into the pool as soon as there was some stirring. 38 years. Christy and I have been married 38 years. To me, that goes fast. To Christy, it's been a long, long journey for her. So if this has been a long journey for this guy, can you imagine being sick for 38 years? Verse 6, when Jesus saw him and knew that he had been ill for a long time, he asked him, now listen to this question Jesus asks, would you like to get well? Does that seem like a silly question? On the surface, it seems like, is this just chatter? Is this just, small talk? Would you like to get well? Anybody that's been sick for 38 years, surely they want to get well. Let me give you 4 reasons why. Well, first of all, you know that Jesus doesn't just do small talk. He never wastes words or syllables or ideas. Everything has a purpose. Let me give you some ideas as to why he probably said this to this man. Number 1, to get his attention. To get his attention. Most people in those days who were beggars would just beg and never really look in the eyes of people. And we saw that later, I think, with Peter and John. They don't really look at people. They're just constantly saying, please help me, please help me. Maybe they have the signs. I don't know. But it was to get his attention, number 1. Number 2, it was to draw his attention to the fact that Jesus knew his need and to remind him of his need in that moment. Number 3, he's about to offer him healing. And number 4, he's saying that so that this man will begin to experience the compassion of Jesus. So it's not just a flippant, hey, would you like to get better? Kind of like rubbing it in kind of thing, all right? There's reason, there's purpose behind what everything Jesus says, and especially now. So we're going to call those first 6 verses, that section, we're calling it could, right? This guy could get better. That's what Jesus is offering. Through a relational contact, not through rules and regulations, even assumptions about life, but through a relational contact, he's saying you could get better. And that is the ultimate question for all mankind, isn't it? That's what I find intriguing about it. That's really what God is asking all mankind. Would you like to get better? It presumes the reality that we are not well, that there's something wrong with us. And that's what Jesus is saying. I know there's something wrong here for you, but he could be saying it to all humanity. It's the ultimate question and the ultimate reality. As we've covered many times, we won't go back into it, we are not well. All of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. All of our righteous deeds are like filthy rags. Okay, so what a question, actually. It's not just small talk. So in those first 6 verses, we say, you know, that's about could. You could get better here. Verse 7. I can't, sir. Guess what that introduces? The can't way of thinking of life. I can't, he said, for I have no one to put me in the pool when the water bubbles up. That kind of leads us to think it was an intermittent spring. No one will put me in the pool when the water bubbles up. Someone else always gets in there ahead of me. Okay, so his view of life is can't. I simply can't. I can't get there on time. And what a picture that is of the whole human race once again. We have made life about who gets there first, right? It's always a competitive thing. And in their mind, the people that were lying around that pool waiting for the bubbles, it's the first one in, you know, is the key. And he says, I will never be the first one in. I can't get there. My condition is hopeless. Okay, so can't comes into the picture. Started with could. You could be healed. I can't, he says. It's a logistical problem. The question Jesus asked was motivated by love, wasn't it? I love you enough to enter into a conversation with you and to make life better for you. His response is a logistical response. Logistically, it's never going to happen. So his can't is about limitations. I have limitations. Here is the good news that he didn't understand, and maybe you don't understand. And that is that there are no logistical problems for God ever. There are no limitations. Let me run down the list. You've heard it before. I'll run down it again. I'll leave so many of these out, but just to get the tip of the iceberg. Seas are parted, giants are slain, prophets are puked, numbers mean nothing, like for the prophets of Baal, how many they had, and for Gideon, how many soldiers he had. Walls fall, waters turn to wine, storms are instantly calmed, the blind can see, the lepers are healed, and the dead are raised. There are no logistical issues for God. We tend to look at the opportunity of could that God gives us and we say, logistically, I just don't see it happening. Okay, so the next section we're going to enter into now again is could. Here we go. John chapter 5, verse 8. Jesus told him, stand up, pick up your mat, and walk. You know, you could do that. You really could do that. You could stand up and walk, is what he's saying. You have never thought you could. You never could before you met me, but now you could do that. Now, is he going to make him do it? No, he's not going to make him. Jesus is never going to force himself on anyone. He doesn't force himself on this guy. He doesn't go grab him and throw him up in the air and say, okay, now walk. He just says, you could do this. Now stand up, grab your mat, and walk. Instantly the man was healed. He rolled up his sleeping mat and began walking. But this miracle happened on the Sabbath. Okay, that last phrase will transition us into the next section, but I want you to see what happened here. He instantly was healed. Now we live in a day where there's a lot of faith healers, you know, and they claim they can heal people, but I honestly have never seen them heal instantly and completely like Jesus always did. And we see it here as well. Instantly and completely, he is healed. He jumps up, grabs his mat, begins to walk. But it's the Sabbath. To you and to me, we say, so what? It's a day of the week. Not to the people of Israel, and certainly not to the leaders of Israel. This is a big deal. And what I want you to know is that Jesus did not forget it was the Sabbath. He knew it was the Sabbath, and he did it anyway. He did it on purpose. That man had been there for maybe 38 years. I don't know, a long time. He was going to be there tomorrow, the day after the Sabbath, but Jesus wasn't going to wait. Jesus, as we've seen so many times, does this on purpose. He's poking the bear is what he's doing. As you can imagine, we now go into verse 10, another section that is about cant. Verse 10. So the Jewish leaders objected. They didn't cheer for him. They didn't say, wow, we've seen you here for years. Look at you. They objected. What are they upset about? They objected. They said to the man who was cured, you can't work on the Sabbath, they say. The law doesn't allow you to carry that sleeping mat. That's religion. You can't. Religion is about you can't. You can't. These are the things you can't do. These are the rules that you're not abiding by, you're breaking. You can't do this. Here's what's really fascinating about them saying this, and that is, it was not a law. It was a rabbinic tradition. There were 35 rules they had set up. It wasn't the law. Rules they had set up concerning work on the Sabbath. And this was one of them. One of them was you cannot carry a mat. We have a rule against that. So what they said was absolutely dishonest. There was no law he had just broken. It was their rabbinic traditions that were broken. But in their minds, the traditions were equal to the law. Now, if you spent any time at all in churches, you know that much of the ruckus, much of the problems that are experienced within the church are not that the laws of God are broken, but the traditions of the church have been broken. Whether it's stained glass windows or the kind of pulpit that's being used, or whether the pastor's wearing the right attire, or it's the music or the youth program, the children program, those are all traditions that really cause religious people to lose their minds. And these religious people say you've broken a law of God, and the religious people today still say that. You're breaking laws of God by doing whatever you're doing here, or not doing what you should be doing. But see what they're saying, you can't. You can't. And when most people come into a church, a local church, that's one of the first things on the list is, what can we and can't we do? So verse 11 says, but he replied, the one who had been healed replied to them, the man who healed me told me, pick up your mat and walk. Isn't that interesting? You know what he can't do? He can't stand up to these thugs. He can't do it. He can't say, I want to believe I would have said, you know what? Stick it in your ear. You know, I'm walking for the first time. I'm walking here. I got stuff going on here. Take your rules and shake it out, you know. But instead he says, it's his fault. It's that guy. He did this. Don't get mad at me. He can't even find the fortitude to stay in his joy, to stay in his excitement, say, I don't care. I have a could in my life now. I could walk. I didn't know I could, and now I could do everything. He still lives with the can'ts. His mind, his body has been changed, his mind has not. And of course, these religious leaders respond to him in verse 12. Who said such a thing as that? They demanded. The man didn't know, for Jesus had disappeared into the crowd. We have our rules. We have our law. Remember, Jesus began this whole interaction with love, and then the can't came along, and I have logistic problems. And we're back to the can't. We have a law that does not allow for such amazing things to happen. And so it probably doesn't surprise you that as we go into the next section, we go back to a could in verses 14 and 15. Afterwards, Jesus found him in the temple. Jesus sought him out again. And he told him, now you're well, stop sinning or something even worse may happen to you. Now you're well. You know what your life could be? You could stop sinning. Which, again, this begs the question, had this man become ill, paralyzed, crippled because of sin? Possibly. Jesus might have known that about him, but not necessarily. We do know that our sin has natural consequences. We don't know whether this was a natural consequence for him, but in the general sense, what Jesus is saying is, you know what now? You could stop sinning. That's what you could do. Now that you've been healed, you could stop thinking the way you think, doing the things you do, start living a whole new life. And he says the same thing to us. Not because Jesus says to you and to me, you know, you could stop sinning. Does it mean that it necessarily will? No, not necessarily, but I have that opportunity now that I've been healed by Jesus. In the spiritual sense, I have the Holy Spirit who can help me stop sinning, live a different way, think differently, think in kingdom terms, not in cultural terms. And that was about learning. Remember, we covered the fact that he introduced love, and the man said, I've got logistics that won't help me here. And the Pharisees come along and say, we have laws against such joy, such excitement, such amazing things happening. And now Jesus has said, you know, you could learn. You could learn how to live life without sinning. Jesus says now you could learn. You could learn how to live a new life. And that's his invitation to us. You could do that. You and I could, if we so choose, now learn to live with Christ in such a way that we no longer habitually live a life of sin that separates us from him, that destroys our relationship with him. Do you see the stark difference between religion and relationship? The Jewish leaders, the Jewish faith was all about the rules, about death. Jesus introduces love that teaches us how to learn, how to live differently in his kingdom. What Jesus says is who Jesus is. It's what he's about. It's what he has for us. A life where sin no longer makes us sick, no longer cripples us, but a life well lived with him. That's who Jesus is. And it's who the Father is. Now we come to the last section. It's actually one verse, verse 16. You guessed it, we're back to can't. Then the man went and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had healed him. He simply can't help himself. He can't just go on with life, with this new life that God has given him. He has to go back to these power brokers, back to these celebrities, back to these people he fears, and he's an absolute coward, as I'll quote a guy here in a minute. You never think of this guy as a coward, but he goes back to the very people he knows hates Jesus and doesn't like what Jesus just did. He can't help himself. He still thinks the same way he's always thought. Australian theologian Leon Morris put it this way in regard to this man at this moment. He simply says, the man was not the stuff of which heroes are made. He just can't do it. He can't stand up to these thugs, to these fakes. And so we have this entire story, as you can see now, that's filled with coulds and can'ts, and they collide. And Jesus does that on purpose. And so, again, today our premise is can't and could are representative of religion versus relationship. Those who live in the religious camp, the can't camp, typically can say things like this: I can't, you can't, God can't. Right? That's always on that story. I can't get to the pool, you know? And the religious leaders, you can't do that. And finally, God can't do those things, right? Sometimes these are rules. Sometimes they're assumptions we make. And this is where our question for today comes into play. Is it possible that I'm still held in the grips of cant, of religion? In Acts 12, we see a great picture of this. King Herod Agrippa had put James, the brother of John, to death. And a lot of the Jewish people loved that. He, wasn't the first martyr, but he was amongst the first. And he puts him to death. And he loved the results he got. He loved the fanfare he received for putting one of the ringleaders of this apostate faith to death. And so he got a new idea. It's Pentecost. I'll do the same to Peter. So he went and had Peter arrested, threw him in prison, threw him in jail. You know the story. And so he's thinking, I'll wait until the Passover's done, and then I'll bring him out and we'll do the same thing. The bottom line is, I'm going to murder Peter. Okay? Peter is done. Peter is in prison, and it says he's chained by 2 chains to 2 different guards. There's guards outside of the jail cell where he is. He has no hope. There is no way he escapes this thing. And then you guess what happens. Let me read it to you. The night before Peter was to be placed on trial, verse 6 of Acts 12, he was asleep. He was fastened with chains. I mentioned that. Suddenly, there was a bright light in the cell, and an angel of the Lord stood before Peter. The angel struck him on the side. I love that part. We never noticed that part. He's chained in there. There's a bright light, and the angel goes, boom! Strikes him in the side. He hits him in the side, and he says, quick, get up! And the chains fall off his wrists. Then the angel told him, get dressed, put on your sandals. So he did. Now put on your coat and follow me, the angel ordered. So Peter left the cell, followed the angel, but all the time he thought it was a vision. He didn't think this was really happening to him. He was dreaming this. He didn't realize it was actually happening. They passed through the first and second guard posts and came to the iron gate leading to the city, and this opened for them all by itself. So they passed through and started walking down the street, and then the angel suddenly left him. Peter finally came to his senses and thought, it's really true. The Lord has sent an angel to save me from Herod and from what the Jewish leaders had planned to do to me, to kill me. My life was over. An angel has saved me. When he realized this, he went to the home of Mary, the mother of John Mark, who would write the book of Mark, by the way, where many were gathered for prayer. The church is gathered in the house for prayer. Verse 13, he knocked at the door in the gate, and a servant girl named Rhoda came to open it. I love this. When all of a sudden the writers insert this person that you never have heard of and will never hear of again. But here's Rhoda. Rhoda is going to come to the door. When she recognized Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed that instead of opening the door, she ran back inside and told everyone, Peter's standing at the door. She hears Peter. She knows him so well because he's preached. She's heard him teach. And she goes, oh, that's Peter. She runs back in and says, Peter's at the door. Peter's at the door. And they respond by saying, you're out of your mind. Does that tell you a little bit about the status of women in that culture? You have lost your mind, they said. When she insisted, they decided it must be an angel. Meanwhile, Peter continued knocking. When they finally opened the door and saw him, they were amazed. Guess what they were praying about? Another translation says they were praying for Peter. Maybe I missed it in there. But they were praying for Peter the whole time. And so they're praying and they're going, God, please release him. Please save him. Please do something for him. He shows up at the door and they go, not possible. We just assume God doesn't do that anymore. See, that's a religious way to look at life. There's no way. That can't happen. Maybe that's an angel, but it's not Peter for sure. You see, even people who name the name of Christ, even those of us who say we follow Christ, still fall into the trap of being religious and saying it can't happen. It just doesn't happen. God is not able to do that. We need to be very careful that that is not the case for you and for me. So the discussion today, the question is about, is it possible that you and I, who have named the name of Christ, said we're following Christ, can still be in the grips of religion? We still see life with a can't way of thinking. So that is the final discussion question today. Here it is. What might that look like for those of us who name the name of Christ to be stuck in the claws, in the grips of religion? What would that look like in our lives? Now for the could category, what does that look like? Well, we know that I could live fully for Jesus, devoted to him, change my life of sin. You could do that. You could be healed. And certainly God could and does. still do things that we assume that would never happen, that he doesn't do anymore. That's what a relationship looks like. I was talking to my mom the other day, and she had just returned from her 6-7 week stint up in the Northwest. My sisters fly her up there in the winter, and then again in the summer. I think she enjoys the summer more. But we were talking, and she had been at my older sister's house. Her name is Terry, and her husband's name is Scott. And she told me about something that really was intriguing to me. She said, I was there, and then one day a guy showed up, and Scott introduced me to him, and he was there to look at Scott's coins. He's a coin collector as a hobby. And he came in and he said, this is Greg, and he introduced my mom, and all of a sudden he realized who she was, and he said, how is Steve doing? And so he had asked about me. Well, Greg is a guy I went to high school with in Shelton, and Greg was an interesting guy in high school, to be sure. A lot of kids made fun of Greg. Greg was not your typical high schooler. He didn't do any of the things the rest of us did. He didn't take part in sports, in music, in theater, in clubs, none of that. Greg was his own guy, and he would come to class wearing a shirt and tie, sometimes even a coat, and he'd carry a briefcase. How many kids in high school do that? So you can see why a lot of kids made fun of him. Honestly, I did not. I thought he was intriguing and interesting, and we never were great friends. It's not as though Greg and I were great friends. I was just intrigued by him, and we would talk from time to time. But again, a very interesting guy in high school. What I came to understand about Greg in high school is that he had been mowing lawns to make money since like he was 9-10 years old. He'd been making money that way for some 11 years, 12 years. That's all he did. But when he came to school, he was dressed up and had the briefcase and all of that kind of thing. And we graduated, and I didn't hear much about him again. Well, that is this Greg that met my mom, and that's why he asked about me. And I was probably one of the few people who did not make fun of him. And so she talked about what we were doing a little bit, I guess. But then he honed in, he focused in on my mom and said, I got to tell you, your husband changed my life. He was speaking of my dad. He said, he literally changed my life. And my mom had no idea. She said, what do you mean? And he went on to explain what was so life-changing about how my dad interacted with him in such a personal, relational way. He said it was about his junior and then senior year of high school where he just didn't attend school very often. Not because he was rebellious, but because his mind was focused on coin collecting, and he would be gone all the time to shows and different locations. And when it came to his senior year, the last part of his senior year, he pretty much figured he would not graduate from high school because he hadn't been around much. And so I guess he had a conversation with my dad, who was the principal, and my dad, who ran a tight ship. Trust me, there were people who did not graduate from high school because of things they did. But I guess he told Greg, he said, you know, I know what you're about. I know what's important to you. I know you're not here because you don't want to be at school, that you have a focus on what you think your future will be. And so I guess he allowed Greg to graduate even though he really didn't deserve to. And that was Greg's own words. He said, I had no business getting to graduate from high school, getting a diploma. But when your husband allowed that and he let me graduate, he said, it changed my life. I couldn't believe how he treated me. Well, I've heard other stories, and my dad never shared that with any of us. I've heard other stories where my dad had interacted with people like that and shown such compassion and grace and latitude, even though he ran a tight ship as a principal of a high school. Now, I say all that just to say that, and this isn't the point of the story, that Greg is now a billionaire. Greg knew what he wanted and went after it from the time he was a kid, and he's now a billionaire, has several houses around the country. And again, he told my mom to say hi to me, and I guess she didn't say anything. I guess he didn't offer to share any finances with us. But he's a billionaire. But he owes it back to my dad treating him so well, knowing undeservingly, he gave me a high school diploma. And that was just like my dad. My dad reminds me of Jesus. My dad has been gone exactly 12 years. And again, none of these stories I ever heard from him. I hear from other people. But he reminds me of Jesus. Are there rules that everybody's living by? Of course there are. But he reminded me of Jesus in the sense that he would look at individual people like Greg and say, instead of, you can't graduate, you can't do these things because, that's against the rules. And instead say, you know what you could do? You could do your best to be here and take part, and you could continue to chase that dream. And that's the difference between relationship and religion. It brings to mind the story of the prodigal son. And you got to know without a shadow of a doubt that the father in that story that Jesus told in Luke 15 was a father who represented the Heavenly Father, who expressed, you could come home. I know you took what you believed was yours. You could come home, and if you came home, we could throw you an incredible party. And you remember it was the older brother who said, this has got to be against the rules. I've been with you the whole time. You never do this for me. But the father's saying, but we could do this to honor him, and we could do that for you as well. But we must do this now. He's the rule breaker, the older brother said. But to the father, that was not near as important. The bottom line today is this. There is a chance that even though you and even though I name the name of Christ and say we want to follow Jesus and know Jesus, it's possible that we could still be held in the grip of religion by the way we think. And we really think life is about the can'ts, the things we can't do, the things God can't do. In fact, life is about a relationship with the Father through His Son, who expresses the truth about the Father. You know what could happen? That's a relational question. You know what can't happen? That's a religious question. I'm sure in the coming months there's going to be a lot of fun had behind me here in this pool, and a lot of great memories have been had here. And I can tell you that there are some great pool scenes throughout history and movies and books, but the greatest pool scene of all time happened right there in John 5 when Jesus showed us the heart of the Father. Thanks for joining us on this beautiful Western Slope day. We love you. Love doing this journey with you.